So we'll go ahead and get started. Okay, so we're going to talk about what to look for when buying a house plant. We're going to talk about the important things in plant care in depth for each of those, some repotting techniques, ways to increase your stock, briefly on classifications, and that's likely where we will stop. I have those most common house plants on there, and each one has my secrets to success. I say those are, a lot of them are things I've learned from other people or have picked up. And so hopefully you have plants that are on that list, and you will be able to, find your plant on there and maybe get some tips and tricks based on some of these plant care techniques we're going to talk about today. Okay, so buying a house plant. The best time to purchase is between late spring and mid-autumn. And so in class, when I'm able to interact a little bit more, I always ask people why between late spring and mid-autumn. And 90% of the time I have crickets in the audience, and I say, well, what's the temperature like between those times? Well, that's warm, right? Because it's summer into autumn and it's warm. So that's the best time to buy plants, because you're not getting them into some crazy transition. So when you buy in the winter time, our houses, and we'll talk about this, about, what it's like environment in your house, but you're taking a plant that has been in a greenhouse, and, very briefly it was maybe at Lowe's or Home Depot or a box store, or maybe you bought it directly from the greenhouse, and you're taking it home to your house. And if it's winter time, you're putting it inside the house, and you can imagine the shock that plant is going to feel. So if you're bringing it home, you can put it outside, and you can slowly transition that plant into your home, into different lighting, just a whole different environment. And so you also don't shock the plant taking it from, the inside of Lowe's to your car when it's 30 degrees outside. My favorite thing is that poinsettias, as an example, are tropical plants, right? We always get them at Christmas time, which leads a lot of people to think they, like the cold. Well, they don't. They are tropical plants. And I remember when we grew a poinsettia crop in Hort Club back in the day, and they, even transferring them from the greenhouse over into the ag building where we were going to send them, was just putting them on the cart. They were going to be outside for maybe a total of 2 minutes. And it was always really stressful when it was super cold outside, because you really can shock them. And within a week of them being home, they start to lose all of those leaves and bracts. And so bring them home when it's nice and warm. The other thing, this is a do as I say, not as I do type moment, where you want to avoid bargains. Okay, there is a reason they are on the bargain shelf. They've been underwatered, they have insects, they look like butt. And so unless you trust yourself to be able to, number one, possibly waste money, and number two, be able to treat whatever that is, avoid the bargain. And if you can't help yourself, and I get it, it happens. If you can't help yourself, and really you should do this with all plants, but especially those bargain plants, you need to isolate that plant. You need to deal with it last when you water, when you fertilize. It needs to be far away in a different room, on the other side of the porch, wherever it is you're keeping your plants. And it needs to be isolated for, at least a month, if not longer. You want to look for danger signs. So are all flower buds open with no signs of new buds? This is something we see a lot on orchids, especially around like Mother's Day. And so if you don't have any new buds, well, that just means in about a week, that plant isn't going to do anything more for you. It also means that plant has been pushed very hard and it doesn't have a whole lot extra going for it. Signs of disease or pest. So you want to be looking on those leaves. You want to be looking around the soil line, around the outside of the pot for things like mealybug, which are going to be like a white cottony substance. Aphids will be up sometimes, tucked in underneath that flower bud. So be looking for those. Disease will be, spotting, mold looking things, just anything that doesn't quite look right. You want to look for leaves not evenly distributed. And so this could mean that the plant, when it was growing in an area where, maybe it wasn't getting enough light. This could also mean that in transport or something like that, it lost leaves, which when it's losing leaves, usually that's mechanical damage. They just break off, and that happens. But what that also means is that disease could have been introduced into that plant. And so you want to avoid any signs like that. Floppy leaves means that it could have a root rot, or it's just not been watered well, which means it's stressed out. You want to avoid seeing any space between the soil and the pot. Again, that means the plant has not been watered appropriately. You want to avoid roots growing out of the pot because that means the plant can be pretty stressed out. It needs to be potted up. So you automatically have a job as soon as you buy it. And then green slime on the soil or the pot is kind of the opposite problem. It's been overwatered. Again, that can lead to root rots, diseases, the gnats that we all loathe, which seem to come in on houseplants, especially from box stores. So keep an eye out for those danger signs when you go to buy a plant, no matter where you buy it from. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about specifically about plant care is going to be temperature. And so one thing that people don't, realize is that most house plants don't do well in temperatures above 75 degrees unless extra humidity is provided. And that always blows people's minds because we think of house plants and normally we think of these tropical plants. And you're like, Alexis, the jungle is hotter than 75 degrees. And I always say, yeah, but what else is the jungle, right? It's super humid. There's water constantly falling on the leaves. It might rain every day, or at least, you're looking at 90% humidity, typical Kentucky summer, right? And so that is why they can thrive in temperatures higher than 75, because there's enough moisture in the air to keep them from desiccating. So I want you to keep that in mind as you start thinking about especially what your house is like. And we're going to talk about humidity shortly. 55-degree minimum is kind of a very safe temperature for all of your house plants. And so these, especially for your non-hardy plants, if you go look into each plant that I have listed later in the PowerPoint specifically, it'll give their low. And some of them are much lower than that. Some of them are even down, to 40 degrees and they'll be fine. But it really depends. So 55 is sort of just a safe way to be. And that's when I bring all my house plants in from outside. If I've put them out is when I know it's going to drop really below 60, but below 55 for sure. You also want to eliminate temperature fluctuations. Again, these plants are native to zones that usually don't have crazy temperature fluctuations. They might have rainy seasons versus dry seasons, but not a whole lot of temp flux on daytime to nighttime. You can go 5 to 10 degrees cooler, that's okay, but you don't want anything where you're putting it outside in the heat during the day and then bringing it in your AC'd house at night. That's probably not going to be very good unless you have a cacti or a succulent. Those can be the exceptions, because again, let's think about where these plants are from. That's the number one thing. If you're not sure what's wrong with your plant, what you're doing wrong, where is it native to? How can you mimic those native environments? And so, right, the desert is really, really hot during the day, and we have huge temperature swings into cooler nights. And so what that does is actually initiate flowering on those cacti. And that can be the same for things like orchids as well. You can get some temp fluctuations, you can initiate bud development. And so if you want to see if your cacti will bloom for you, try that out, getting those cooler nighttime temperatures. So signs that the temperature is just not right on those plants, you're going to see leaf curl, followed by browning and leaf fall. That's when it's too cold. If your leaves wilt, if the edges turn brown, they just kind of get crunchy pretty quickly. It's too warm, and so they're respiring out of their leaf surface very quickly, and they're just losing too much water. If your flowers are short-lived, if it feels like they bloom and they should last, a few days, and they're only lasting a day, they're probably too warm. Again, it's respiring too quickly. If you get spindly growth, even though you have good light. Again, that could be too warm. And if you have leaves that rapidly yellow, that can be that you had too much of a temp flux. And so if you, like Amy, left any of your plants outside last night where we got those nice cool frost like temperatures, if your plant survives, you will still likely see that rapid yellowing, and just all the leaves are going to fall. And not necessarily it's dead. You just might have to be extra careful and nurse it back to life. I will warn you, a lot of these characteristic danger signs are going to sound a lot alike. It's very unfortunate. There are some slight differences, and there's a lot of different things you need to look at, but as I go through this, you're going to be like, Alexis, these are all the same. And I'm going to tell you, I know. That's why you really have to focus on each plant individually. Lighting. We all know lighting is important, right? One of those things that plants have to survive. There are two aspects of light for plant growth. You have duration. And so most of houseplants, well, most plants in general are going to require 12 to 16 hours of natural or strong artificial light. And so that is light that's going to be both on the warm and the cool spectrum. So if you buy a grow bulb, that grow bulb has warm and cool spectrum on it in just that one bulb. If you're cheap like me, you can get what I use. You can use anything you want. You have to be able to put two bulbs in it. But what I use for my plants in my office is a ballast light, a shop light, and that takes those two long bulbs. One bulb is warm, one bulb is cool, and that is the full spectrum. And so I spend a lot less money on bulbs because they're not grow bulbs. And they work just as well. I start my seedlings with that, anything like that. So there's a little tip there for you. And then intensity is going to be important. So it varies among plants. And we know that when we think about it, full sun to full shade, that's light intensity. So keep it simple. When we talk about what is full sun inside, things start to get a little hairy here. And so full sun inside is within 2 feet of a south facing window. Okay. So very close. Some direct sun is going to be a brightly lit area with some sunlight falling on the leaves during the day. So I like to tell people, if your kitchen table gets those light beams that hit it, at some point during the day for, at least an hour, that's a perfect spot. You just want to put your plants where those light beams would hit. You've got bright but sunless. Then you've got semi-shade. So this is going to be moderately lit area, and you're going to wanting to be between 5 and 8 feet to a sunlit window. So that's a bright lit window, but you don't need to be right up in it. And then shade, everybody tends to think of this much darker than it actually is. It should be bright enough to read a newspaper for at least, half of the day. And so much brighter than you think, although a lot of plants you can just stick on a really dark corner and they'll be fine. They might look a little funky, but they'll be fine. And so some signs of too little light, this is true with your seedlings as well, is you're going to get spindly, pale growth. Pale growth can sometimes be confused for nitrogen deficiency, and the difference between those is going to be where you see the paleness. If it's overall pale, the veins, everything about that leaf is pale, it's most likely not enough light, versus nutrient deficiency, you're going to see some around that veination, a little bit more of that paleness, at least at the beginning. You won't have flowers if you don't have enough light. Your lower leaves are going to dry up and fall sooner, and they're going to go really pale, they're going to go yellow, and they're going to fall. Your variegated plants, those leaves will turn all green. That's because they need more photosynthesis. Well, photosynthesis, chloroplasts, which is, one of the main ingredients, right, for photosynthesis, is green. And so the more green leaves it had, the more it can photosynthesize. And when it's really searching for light, that's what will happen. If you have too much light, you're going to see scorching. It's going to be very similar to too warm of a temperature, but you're going to see them get crunchy a lot faster if you get too much light, because they're burning, right? They're getting sunburn. So keep an eye out for that. Watering. Okay, this is a big one for houseplants, especially during the winter. More plants are killed by overwatering than underwatering. And so when in doubt, don't water, which works for most people. You want to remember to reduce your watering in the winter. So kind of think about how often you watered your plants in the summertime, whether they were inside or outside. If it was once a week, you're going to reduce that by at least half. In the wintertime, I usually only water my plants about once a month. If they're in really bright sunlight or really close to a heat vent or something like that, where they're going to lose water faster, I might water them twice a month. But once a month for me personally in my environment is plenty for my plants. And I give them a good soak. I'm drenching them in the sink or in the bathtub and letting them sit there and water for a few hours, and once a month. And so my husband always is like, what have you done, when I forget to take them out of the bathtub in the morning. So just remember that your roots need air as well as water. And this is why overwatering kills your plants, because they also need to breathe through their root system. So the soil should be moist, but not saturated. If you can keep it consistently like that, then you're doing better than most of us. That can be a little bit hard to do, but I tell people you want your soil to be the consistency of a wrung out sponge, where you really can't wring out any more water, but the sponge is definitely moist to the touch. Some plants, though, again, this goes into knowing where that plant is from, knowing specifics about each plant. Some of them will benefit from drying out before watering. Succulents are a prime example of this. They want to be completely dried out, and then they want to be drenched because that mimics that rainy season that they get. You want to make sure your water is not running around the sides of your pot or sitting on the surface. And so just keep an eye. That's why I put mine down, in the bathtub or in the sink and let them soak that up from the bottom, because I wait so long to water in between that. I want to make sure that that soil isn't hydrophobic. And then some plants, chlorine really doesn't bother, which is going to be in your tap water. But some plants, things like Epsicia, which is flame violet, or your African violet, sometimes can be really sensitive to chlorine. So an easy way to eliminate that is just leave it out overnight and let that chlorine evaporate. So that can be pretty simple. If you've just noticed that you're doing everything right with your plant, but it doesn't seem to be thriving, try eliminating the chlorine. So too little water, most people know the signs of too little water, right? It's limp, the flowers fade, you lose leaves. That one is usually pretty identifiable. Too much water, though, can be a little bit harder for a lot of people to determine. So you still can have limp leaves, and this is because those roots are so waterlogged, they're actually not transporting that water up, and most of the time they're diseased at that point. But you might have rotten areas, see some molding, things like that. Your flowers will get moldy, the leaves will curl and yellow. You'll lose both old and young leaves at the same time. So that's one thing that can really be identifiable. And then make sure you're pulling that plant out of its pot and looking at the roots. If they're not white and plump and fleshy, then they are not happy. Okay. And so try and really reduce that watering. You may even have to repot into drier soil if the problem's really bad. Okay, humidity. Humidity is one of the easiest ones we can deal with, but it's the one everybody kind of forgets about. And again, I go back, I'm going to repeat it 100 times during this presentation. I go back to where is that plant native to? Is it the jungle or is it the desert? And so central heating in your house in the wintertime can produce air with the relative humidity of the Sahara Desert. Now, those of you who are growing cacti, things that are native to deserts, you're in good shape. Okay. For the rest of us who are growing, pothos or whatever it is you're growing, those are mostly jungle plants and they do not like the Sahara Desert. Okay. So we want to do things like misting. And so not a spray bottle, a mist bottle. So be specific about which one you buy. You want something that has a very fine mist. I tell people the easiest way to know if it's a fine enough mist is how unpleasant would it be if you squirted it in your face. And a mist will be pleasant, on a hot day, it's a pleasant thing to get versus a squirt bottle that has really fine of really fine setting will be a lot less pleasant because you get a lot of big droplets on your face. Okay, so think of it that way. You want to use tepid water. That's going to be really important. And you want to do this in the morning. And I always quiz my master gardeners at this point because they've had, a bunch of classes by houseplant time. And I say, why do we want to do it in the morning? And this one they usually get, and I'm very proud of them. But the reason why is because we want those leaves to dry out during the day. They have sunlight during the day. They're most active in their photosynthesis during the day. And those leaves are going to dry out versus doing it at nighttime. Those leaves are less likely to, and then that's when you get disease problems. You can also group your plants. So this is a really good tactic to use especially if like you're going away on vacation for a couple weeks or something and nobody can miss those plants. You can group them. You're going to put several pots together and you create a microclimate of high relative humidity. And so it seems like, how would that work? But really it does, especially for your foliage rich plants. Just cram those babies all in side by side. And as they release water out of their leaves throughout the day, it'll just kind of create this little tiny cloud around your plants. And so that's a good one. And another thing that you can do is double potting. The only time I would do this is for plants that really need extra high humidity. Orchids are a good example of this, but there's lots of plants out there. And so if you can't seem to give that plant in an area where it's staying humid enough, double potting could be an option for you. And that you're going to put a pot into a larger container, and the space around there, you only want an inch or two of extra space. You're going to fill it with peat moss, moisten that down before you put it in there because it'll be easy. And then you're just going to keep that peat moss moist and it will evaporate and give you a good relative humidity area around that. So that's an option. So if you don't have enough humidity, it's again going to resemble not enough water because it's essentially what it is. But instead of not enough water in the pot, you're not getting it in the air. So if you know you're watering well, or maybe you just watered, within the last week and your plant still looks like it's struggling, don't keep watering it. Try increasing your humidity first, and then, give it a couple weeks and see where you're at. And so it's gonna look a lot like not enough water. Too much humidity, again, is going to very much resemble too much water, because that's exactly what it is, except you're not going to have those root problems. You're going to see it all above ground. And so you're going to get mold. Mold's the biggest one, but patches where your leaves are just really soft by the petiole and they're kind of rotty and just slimy maybe, and they just fall off. Even when they're nice and green and healthy, they're falling off with those brown spots. That's too much humidity. Fertilizer. So we're going to break this down into really, really basics, and my soil science professors would be very upset with me for breaking it down so minimally, but this is what you need to know. Nitrogen is your leaf maker. Phosphates are your root maker. Potash is your flower maker. So this is true in all plants, right? Doesn't matter what it is. They do a lot of other things as well, but those are the main things. Your liquid feeds, when it comes to houseplants, are most effective, especially if you need to do something pretty quick. You can use a slow release fertilizer. I recommend using those if you kind of have the plant where it needs to go. You can do a slow release. I do a slow release on mine because otherwise I will forget to feed them, let's be honest. And you want to feed them regularly during the growing season. So whenever that season is, there are some plants that their growing season is going to be more in the winter time. Your holiday cactus, things like that, want phosphorus in November and December because that's when they're blooming. Potash, because that's when they're blooming. That is when they're making flowers. That's what they want. But during the growing season, which is going to be warmer, they're making a lot of those leaves and they need more nitrogen. So think about that when you think about what kind of plant you have. If you have a foliage plant, you still need to give them phosphates and potash, but you're going to create a lot more leaves when you have enough nitrogen. And if you have plants that look super healthy, you're like, why aren't you blooming? You should be blooming. Well, maybe they need some more potash. Usually with your liquid fertilizers, you can use any liquid fertilizer. You do not have to use the houseplant specific ones. I do not like those ones at all because they are so low in fertilizer. They're like a 1% nitrogen. And so I prefer to just use what I would normally use in my garden, and I dilute it. So you could use a Miracle Grow for your tomatoes as an example, but you're going to dilute it by, half, and you're going to water it over a period of time. And so you might just mix up a gallon jug of fertilizer that you diluted by half, and that's what you're going to use over the next month or two to water your plants. Okay. Again, during the growing season is going to be important. If you don't have enough fertilizer, of course, you get your slow growth. You get that chlorosis that I talked about, which is lack of nitrogen. You get those yellowing out of leaves. You might not have blooms, or they're just pitiful in comparison to what they should be. And you drop leaves pretty quickly. Too much fertilizer, remember, fertilizer is a salt. And so especially on your clay pots, one of the reasons I like clay pots, because they kind of show signs earlier, but really even plastic pots, you'll see white crusting that forms, and that's just the extra salts that are leaching out onto the pot. You'll see crispy edges, spotting. The growth will actually stunt in the summertime, and then it'll suddenly be super lanky in the wintertime, which again can look a lot like light damage, not enough light, but it could be fertilizer. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so those are the basics of, what you need to know to grow a houseplant successfully. They're very basic, and I just kind of went in depth. And so hopefully, if you've got a plant that you're having trouble with, you can figure out from those basics which thing maybe you can adjust. And remember, it takes weeks or months to see that adjustment if it happens. So don't give up too quickly. Repotting, these are the questions I get. First of all, you want to repot in the springtime if you're going to do it. So start off with, is the plant pot bound? So pot bound, I have that picture of that spider plant right there, and you can see how it has taken the form of the pot it was in. So I would say that pot or that plant is pot bound. And so if it is not pot bound, you want to return it to its home. Now, if you want to, make your pot prettier, or, you broke your pot or something, you can of course change your pot, but you don't want to put it in anything any bigger than it was. If it is pot bound, is it small? Is it less than 10 inches across? If it's not, if it's a big plant, you have the option of top dressing, which is not my favorite technique, I'll be honest with you, but it can get you through if you're not quite ready to pot it up. So top dressing is exactly what it sounds like. You're just putting a thin layer of a compost or a soil media on top of the soil. The reason I do not like this is because you end up putting soil up the plant stem. So for some plants, they don't care. This does not bother them at all. Other plants are more sensitive to that. And so that's why I don't love this method. I'd rather put the soil at the bottom, which is root pruning. We're going to talk about here in a sec. If it's a smaller plant, less than 10 inches across, do you want the plant to grow bigger? So this is important. If you do want it to get bigger, then go ahead and repot it. And so when you repot, you just want to go the next step up. A lot of the times I see people going too big, too fast. And that's where you can see that picture there on the left at the bottom. You want a plant that will just barely fit into the next size pot. And so an inch max is what you want to be able to put. An inch of soil all the way around is what you're looking at. So just one size up. Okay. Don't go crazy. If you do not want the plant to go bigger, which is often the case with houseplants because we just don't physically have the space for it, you want to repot it after you root prune. And so going back to that picture of the spider plant there at the top, if I was going to root prune that because I don't want it to get any bigger, I would take off that little bottom lip. And so that, where you can see, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but that bottom, inch and a half that looks inset, I would take a hacksaw and I would saw that right off. And then I would put an inch or so of soil back in its original pot, and I'd plop that baby back in there, water it, and call it a day. So you can root prune, you can divide your plants very well, especially houseplants. They're vigorous and they usually withstand that. Which leads me to increasing your stock. So why do we propagate our own plants? Well, because we're cheap and we like to propagate more so that we can have more without having to buy them. We might be wanting to replace aging specimens with vigorous new ones. So this is true if you've got your grandma's Christmas cactus or whatever it is, and it's just looking bad. You can repropagate this. It's the same exact plant, right? It is the same DNA. It is a clone, but you are making it vigorous again. Plants that are otherwise unattainable, we want to get some of those. So again, you've got, an old plant cultivar that you can't find anymore, that your friend has. So you get a friendship plant from them, and you are able to have that plant you can't find. That's how I got most of my plants, is through propagation. And then you can give them away. One of my favorite stories, I've had calls of people who, their grandmother gave all of the grandkids a piece of the jade plant she's had, for 35 years. And that's something special for them, right? It's just grandma's plant. And so I think that's really neat. When you're doing propagating, you want to look for rooting hormone. Not all plants need rooting hormone. The rule of thumb, this is again very general, that's why it's a rule of thumb, is if it's a vining plant, you probably don't need rooting hormone, because those vining plants usually create roots called adventitious roots all along the stem. And so you usually don't need it, but you can use it and it's not going to hurt them. You need a transparent bag, polyethylene bag, so something that is going to breathe and will let the light in. You need a rooting media, so this can be something like vermiculite, perlite. It can even be, your pro mix, your potting mix. That's plenty fine. And then rooting bags. So rooting bags can be, I'll show you here in a propagation technique what rooting bags are. So we're going to talk about a few techniques and then we're about done. Okay. So layering is most of your climbers, anything, again, those vines that have long flexible stems. This can take a long time to root. This is something you can do with hydrangeas, is layering, as well as your raspberries and blackberries. Any place that branch touches the ground, they'll root. A lot of people don't know that hydrangeas are one of those things. And so in the springtime, you can choose a vigorous stem. You pin it down to the soil. So if it's, a plant that you have in the ground, you bend that over. I like to take those landscape staples, sod staples, and use those, and you pin them down to the ground so that it's making good soil contact. I like to cover those up, cover up the sod staple with a little bit more soil. And then if you're doing it with a house plant, you can just use another pot. And then once rooting has taken place, you can cut it off from the mother plant and free it and either dig it up and move it somewhere else, or it's already in a new pot and you have two. Air layering is where those rooting bags come into to play. Air layering is difficult. Okay. This is something that, all the nerds here on this, plant nerds on this presentation, feel free to try it, but don't be discouraged if it doesn't work. I've seen this done in professional greenhouses by professors, and it only worked, 1 out of 3 times. So this is for your thick stem plants that have become leggy. So Dracaena is a really good example of this, where anything that kind of has that like bamboo-esque look to it, but lots of plants, this can be done too. You cut the tip of the plant. You're going to make a notch. You're going to take off a section. You can see in that picture where a 1/2-inch section, the bark has actually been stripped away. It then is painted with rooting hormone. A bunch of sphagnum moss is packed into those rooting bags, and you tie it off and you wait. And so those roots will form where that bark has been stripped. Once those roots have formed, you cut it off from the mother plant, you put it in a pot, and boom, you got a new one. So again, that can be a little bit difficult, but it's worth a shot if you are just wanting to try something cool. Offsets are the easy way because the plant essentially has done the propagation for you. You see this a lot on, your succulents. I see this a lot on succulents as little offsets. And so it's exactly what it sounds like. It's just a little baby plant that has come out. It usually has rooted itself into that media, and you can just cut it off from the mother plants, keeping the roots, dig them up real easy and put it in a new pot. Boom, already done. And plantlets, things like your spider plants, you've ever had a spider plant, it does this. It shoots off, and the same with strawberries, right? It shoots off runners, and we peg those down to moist soil. They form roots if they haven't already. Usually this happens really quickly, like a week or two, if it's in the good environment. And then you cut it off from the mother plant and you got new ones. So that is a really easy way because the plant's pretty much done all the hard work for you. And then division. So these are things you can do with your peonies, but you can also do this, your irises. I know this is houseplant talk, but I wanted to let you all know since it's that time of year to do that. But with your houseplants, you're doing this in the springtime, and you can cut these up. Anything that has multiple clumps on it, rosettes, things like that. You knock that plant out of its pot in the spring and you pull those things apart. And so I have done this with peace lily, really successfully. Ferns, most of the time you can do this with your ferns, your peace lilies. And again, I take a hacksaw and I cut it right down the middle, and I make, cut it in half, thirds, even quarters, depending on how large that plant is, pot each of those up separately, and I've got 4 new plants. And so division is a good one to have a way. It's a way to have a plant that's already mature kind of instantly. Spores, I'm not going to talk about. I'm going to leave, but you all have access to this. This is for ferns. This is another one of those plant nerd things that you can try to do, but it's going to take a very, very long time to get there, but it can be fun when you succeed. Cuttings are another easy one. This is what you're going to use for things like your holiday cactuses. You can take cuttings of them to rejuvenate them. You're going to use some rooting hormone. You're going to stick them in a pot. Make sure you do lots of cuttings per one pot. This is in case you have any failures, but also it looks better than one little spindly thing sticking out of your pot. Choose healthy things. Use rooting hormone. If it's a succulent, you might want to leave it to dry out on the soil surface for a couple days before you stick it down in that soil. Same with leaf cuttings. It's amazing what you can get from just a single leaf. Just make sure you're using rooting hormone, especially for leaf cuttings. So here's talking about a whole leaf versus parts of leaves. I like to show this because a begonia is a great example. Everywhere there's a vein on a begonia, you can get a plant to form. And so, a begonia might have 20 veins on it, and if done properly, each one of those veins from a single leaf can produce, 20 plants. Cane cuttings are pretty easy. You're going to cut it into several pieces, insert it into the media, and let it go, and just wait. And then this is the last slide that we'll cover, and we'll take some questions. Remember, this is important, and why I cover this is going back to fertilizer. So remember, you have foliage houseplants, flowering houseplants, your flowering pot plants, which are going to be your temporary floral displays like azaleas or Easter lilies. And then you've got your cacti, which we all know what those are.